Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. As the war in Gaza rages on, many politicians continue to voice support for the two-state solution framework for peace in Israel and Palestine. Just last week, Emmanuel Macron announced that he and Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince will host a conference to help revive that peace process. But others have given up on the two-state solution, not least because of Donald Trump's proposal to annex Gaza Strip altogether. But for many, the two-state solution has actually been dead for many, many years. Joining us, we have the University of Pennsylvania professor Ian Lustick, a leading scholar on the Israel-Palestine dispute and author of Paradigm Lost. In that book, he argues that rather than working towards a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine are actually living in a one-state reality. Hello and welcome, Professor Lustick.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Let's just address the core of your book. Many people in Europe and indeed other parts of the world are firm believers in the two-state solution. Yet you argue that the solution, this so-called solution, is no longer viable, and in actual fact, continuing to pursue it harms efforts to attain peace. Can you briefly give an overview of that argument?
Well, I'll try. There's an interesting ambiguity about the word must in English, and that is it has really two meanings. And people tend to say, who are two-staters, that it must be possible. And by that, they mean actually two things, but they forget that. One is, since anything else would be inconsistent with my values and hopes, it must be possible to get the two-state solution. That's, of course, a kind of solipsistic way of looking at the world. It's not realistic at all. Must also means that the way the world is constructed, it is inevitable that this will happen. Now, actually, I don't think people want to admit that most of what they mean by must now is the first one and not the second one. Not only is it not considered by anyone I know seriously to be inevitable, but for the last 20 years, I'd say, I haven't been able to find anyone, any expert or pundit, who presents a scenario with a process of political change in Israel and among the Palestinians and in the United States and wherever else it has to take place, leading to the consummation of a negotiated two-state solution. When I was in graduate school in the 1970s and 80s and afterwards, I was I don't want to say believer, I was a firm advocate of the two-state solution. I thought there was at least a 25 to 35% chance of it, and I worked very hard for it. It was only when I started to get very bored with my own thinking in the early aughts, I realized that I was not looking at the world in a way that was interesting anymore. I kept focusing on, well, maybe the Labor Party will put together a coalition at the same time that the United States president finally follows American national interest, stands up to the Israel lobby. Maybe that settlement won't be built right there, so they'll still be able to build a bridge. All of those questions, I realized, that were boring and unimportant. When I started looking at the situation through a different perspective, I realizing that just as the Galilee became part of Israel without ever it being officially annexed, so that's what has happened to the West Bank. And Meron Ben-Venisti, back in the 1980s, he and I argued all the time. He tended to argue that it had already occurred by the end of the 80s, although he changed a little bit during the Intifada. I argued, no, just like Britain showed by getting out of part of Ireland, and France showed by getting out of all of Algeria, that if you were willing to undergo the threat of a civil war, you could still get out of a territory like the West Bank and Gaza. So,
okay, let's just jump in there.
But now that's done.
The fundamental thing you're saying there is that Israel is so deeply embedded in the West Bank, it's not going to pull out. I mean, there's a talk, there's a plan on the table, there's a rough idea about what's going to happen with East Jerusalem, and that suddenly all these settlers, 600,000 of them, they're going to up and go, and that Israel has the political will to do this.
Right. I mean, even Shaul Arieli, the hero, the expert hero of all those who try to keep drawing maps that could depict a viable Palestinian state, he no longer draws the maps. He says, look, it's all a matter of political will, which is to say that if it's all a matter of political will, it's really politics from the beginning, and he is unable to portray anything he believes in that could happen that would lead to it. It's not so much just the settlers. I want to be clear about this. As you say, there are over 500,000 Israeli Jewish settlers on in the West Bank outside of expanded East Jerusalem, but there are another more than 250,000 inside expanded Jerusalem, which is out across the Green Line. So there's 750,000. 1 out of every 10 or 11 Jewish Israelis lives across the Green Line. Israel has changed, however, and that's what counts. The reason why all these settlers are there, why this tens of billions, maybe $100 billion have been used in this way, why government after government, no matter which party has sustained it, is because Israel is not the Israel it used to be. The settlement juggernaut reflects an Israel that has changed from what in American parlance was a kind of blue or purple state, Connecticut or New Jersey, into Oklahoma or Idaho.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to pick up on this. So the first point is that Israel is embedded in the West Bank. And the second part is that there's no political will within Israel to do it. I mean, I would say that Israeli society, and not just politics and political parties, rejects the idea of a peace process. The idea is peace is a dirty word and has been for 2 decades, really, within Israeli society. So the idea that any Israeli government is actually genuinely going to engage with an idea that produces a two-state solution is for the birds.
Right, and no politicians talk as if that isn't true. The left that is Meretz, for example, the Labor Party, hardly exists anymore. If we're talking about a split in Israeli politics, it's between the anti-Netanyahu camp and the pro-Netanyahu camp. But a huge part of the anti-Netanyahu camp is rabidly in favor of Greater Israel. It wants to annex and absorb these areas. So what we're going to have if we don't have Netanyahu in Israel will be a right-wing government. It might not have Ben Gvir in it, but it will be just as formidable a force, absolutely unwilling to countenance negotiations that even might lead to something like a two-state solution proposal, let alone something that the Palestinians would accept.
So, and we say this as we know that a new offensive is starting in Gaza, which the Israeli government and Israeli spokesman is going to be more severe, more profound in its effect than that has been in the last year and a half, which is saying, it's quite something. In addition to the statements from the likes of Ben Gvir, who want to annex Gaza. So that's the reality on the ground and the political reality. Let's put Israeli politics and even that horrendous situation in Gaza aside. Why do international statesmen, why does the international community continue to pursue this idea when you state the political reality within Israel? And we haven't even spoken about the United States.
It's a fascinating question, and I'll go even further. I'll say that the Macron, the Saudis, the people who will engage in these negotiations, they know very well they're not going to succeed. So that makes it an even more interesting question. Why do elites in the United States, in Israel, among the Palestinian Authority, over and over again for the last 20 years, start these diplomatic merry-go-rounds? And I call them a merry-go-round because of this. Henry Kissinger, back in the early 70s, coined the phrase the peace process. Now, a process is a set of stages that leads from a chassis to a chassis with an engine in it, then a chassis with doors around it, and then a car. Okay, an embryo moves through certain stages. That's a process. It leads from something to something else. There's movement along that, and you can trace it. But we have not seen a peace process. This is a merry-go-round, a carousel. There's movement all the time, and it goes through recognized patterns, but not go anywhere. Why, you ask? The reason is what we call in political science a Nash equilibrium. When you think of politics or economics, you usually think that equilibrium is a positive thing. It's the result of the invisible hand. Everyone's doing what their comparative advantage is, and so on and so forth. But what Nash showed, and what he got the Nobel Prize for, is that you can actually have equilibria that are not positive. People can play a game with one another in which nobody likes what's happening, but what is happening is better than anybody could get otherwise. So let's take the four main players in this game historically. The United States government, the Israeli government, usually a Likud government, the Palestinian Authority, and what I call the peace process industry. For the time being, let's put the EU with those people cheerleading the peace process. They want a two-state solution. All four of them have things that they would much rather have than a peace process merry-go-round that's humiliating, exhausting, embarrassing, and doomed to failure. But it's better than what? Well, for the United States, it's better to get on that diplomatic merry-go-round than a president being exposed to Israel lobby attacks for not being supportive of Israel enough, or EU and international obloquy for doing nothing to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Instead, the United States said, we support a two-state solution. We support the peace process. See, we are talking to the Israeli government. You can't criticize us. We're working with the Israeli government. Now, the Israeli government would love to have the whole problem just go away. The Palestinians go away. Israel permanently and unquestionably absorb the territories. But they can't get that. So they'll live with a phony process that might recur of negotiations in which they can be seen to be ready in some principled way to make painful compromises under the following 23 conditions, which everybody knows will never be met. The Palestinian Authority would love to have a real two-state solution with a state that they can rule and be the sovereign masters of in the West Bank and Gaza with East Jerusalem as their capital. They know they're not going to get that, but they can get, if they play this game and get on the merry-go-round, $400 to $450 million a year. They have been getting it from the international system, and a standard of living for a few 100,000 Palestinians in the West Bank cities that are controlled by the PA, sort of controlled. Not now, it's the question even whether they have that, but certainly it's better than they would have if they gave up. They think if they gave up the two-state solution idea. The fourth group is the peace process industry. Now, it's not just the think tanks and pundits and scholars and diplomatic conference centers that have been involved in trying to get a two-state solution for decades. It's also those who oppose it. Those who oppose the two-state solution also want the process to continue so that they can scare their funders into giving them more money, giving them more settlers, quickly grab that mountaintop before the two-state solution arrives. That's the way the two-state solution, the peace process industry uses their fundraising. They would love to get a two-state solution, but if they can't get it, at least they can get a closing window that allows them to raise money and mobilize support for something that, if we don't do it now, it'll be impossible. Now, that's the short answer to your question. It's not so short.
It sounds deeply cynical. It sounds deeply cynical.
It's not cynical. In the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn described a meeting during the Stalinist times that you may know about, in which there's a Communist Party meeting in the Caucasus, and up on the stage are the managers of the local factories and the Politburo, the local communist leaders, and in the hall are somebody mentions Stalin, and everyone stands up and starts applauding, including everyone on the stage, but they can't stop applauding. They're applauding and applauding and applauding. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, finally Solzhenitsyn says, one of the factory managers just sat down, and everybody sat down, the meeting started. The KGB, that night, took that guy away, sent him to the Gulag for, 10 years or something, and told him never be the first to stop clapping. And if you go online, you can see that Stalin had this problem, and he solved the problem of everybody's clapping and nobody wanting to stop. He would roll his eyes and look at people, but he finally decided, I'm going to ring a bell. And then you hear the bell ring and everything stops. So it's not cynical, it's real. And when I gave this talk, I gave it to the PA in Ramallah, to a PA think tank, and Nabil Shath was there. And after I got done describing he stood up and said, yes, and we're all still clapping. So it's not cynical. It's something that people who are involved in recognize. They know it. You can see you see it in John Kerry's face.
Yeah, but the Israelis themselves stopped clapping years ago.
No, I'm saying they're still clapping. That is, let's take Yair Lapid, okay? They still talk about a two-state solution because it's a safe political harbor. That's why all of Congress, most of Congress is now, yes, we're open to a two-state solution. Don't criticize us. They know it's not going to happen, but that's partly what makes it valuable to them. They'll never be exposed to, well, exactly what are you willing to pay for that two-state solution? How much does Israel have to give? They never have to answer the question. It's the perfect safe political harbor. And it's true for centrist Israelis, except the centrist Israelis there are two things you have to watch for. One is to what extent they do that just because it's politically convenient. But there's another rationale, which is it's not that we believe in the two-state solution. We believe in the necessity of the image of the two-state solution. And if you read books by Asher Susser or other people that I've quoted in my writings, you can see that what they say is not we have to get a two-state solution, but we cannot afford to let the idea that there might be a two-state solution die, because if it's gone, we'll have to face the fact that there are more Arabs living between the river and the sea than there are Jews now. The problem of democracy. That's the actual problem. So there's a disingenuous aspect to the people who are still clapping, but they are still clapping.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that point in a second, in a couple of minutes' time. But I do want to talk about the consequences, the immediate consequences of this, constantly talking about the two-state process, and what I see is the legacy of the Oslo peace process and the impact it particularly has on the Palestinians. But I want to encourage people watching, just remind everyone watching, this is 45 minutes long, this conversation. Please do get your questions in early. Start putting them in the Q&A box below, should be at the bottom of the screen, or in the chat box. For some reason, I can't see the Q&A box. Yes, I can. There it is. It's just there. So put your questions in the Q&A box, and then you can put your questions directly to Ian Lustick. I can see it traveling around the West Bank on our study tours. There's huge resentment towards the PA. The PA is an extension of the Israeli security apparatus, and it's essentially the West Bank has become like a Bantustan. It's a fig of democracy. Hasn't had elections for ages because they're so fearful of ceding power to Hamas, and it enables the Israelis to say there's some kind of democratic control locally, but it's going nowhere.
Yes, I've written a number of books on Israel's relationship to the West Bank and Gaza and many articles, but my first book was on the Arab minority inside of the Green Line. And one of the ways, and it was on the system of control that Israel used to keep that minority quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. And one of the things that they did was they set up in every ministry an Arab department run by a Jew, but with a deputy Arab. And that is, if you were an Arab and you went to the Department of Education or Interior, you couldn't go to the usual clerk. You had to go to the clerk that dealt with Arab affairs. Now, what the PA is in Judea and Samaria, they are the Arab department for Judea and Samaria. They do exactly what those Arab departments did. If you need a permit, if you're an Arab, you need a travel permit, you need a license to import or export something, you go to the PA. The PA goes to Israel, gets the permit under certain conditions, takes charges the client, exercises political favoritism. They are acting exactly as the Arab departments did inside of Israel. Now, it took 70 years for the Arabs in Israel to actually become out from military government. They were ruled by military government until 1966. To have some measure of political clout, even one political party, Arab party, got into the government for a while, a few years ago. Well, it'll take 75, 80, maybe 90 years for the West Bank and Gaza Arabs to go through the same progress. But as I'm pointing out, that's the kind of question that we should be asking. That's how you look at the West Bank now and Gaza, even though we're in the throes of a very different kind of situation there right now. Yeah. Which we can talk about if you'd like.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the additional thought is that if there's supposedly a peace process out there that's viable, the idea of fighting or having any kind of resistance is illegitimate.
So what I would try to get across is that occupations end in two ways. There are two ways occupations end. The American occupation of the South after the Civil War ended by the integration of the South into the United States. It's not just through withdrawal that occupations end. The occupation of, well, let's say Wales ended with the Welsh integration into the United Kingdom. The integration of Ireland, the annexation, it lasted 120 years before most of Ireland seceded. And I don't say that there won't be two states eventually. There could be, but it would be the result of secession, just like Ireland seceded, and through the result of change in Israeli politics as the Irish Catholics, I mean the Palestinian Arabs, become the political bellwether inside the country. That's the kind of thinking that we can imagine a two-states picture of the future emerging, not through negotiations, but through secession down the road. And that's why I am encouraging people to think much more broadly than they usually do. Don't think this problem is going to be solved in a way that produces a pretty picture for you in your lifetime. This is not that kind of problem anymore. It used to be. It used to be a problem that could be. It stopped being that kind of problem about 20 years ago. Yeah.
So those who keep saying the two-state solution are kidding themselves that it is possible. Next week, next month, next year, whenever.
They're either kidding themselves or they're doing it for very good political reasons.
Yeah. The fundamental thing is that the fundamental problem for Israel is that if you say there's a one-state solution, unless you get rid of the Arabs or get rid of the Palestinians, you've got a deeply undemocratic state.
Right. Well, I don't speak about the current situation as a one-state solution. In fact, I don't offer a one-state solution because a solution implies a picture of the future that's pretty and you know how to get there. I think looking at the way women got the vote over generations in Western industrial democracies, or how Catholic Irish or blacks in the United States, I see how partial democracies, parliamentary democracies that have excluded and disdained and oppressed huge populations for generations, how do they eventually include them? Well, that takes a long time, and it takes reorganization and cultural change. It takes the dominants, like the males, to divide so that both the challenger males and the incumbent males look at women who are mobilizing and say, oh, maybe we could get their votes. Because it's a centripetal process that the way the Unionists and the Liberals competed for Irish Home Rule votes in the 1870s and 80s, that helped produce Irish political power inside of the United Kingdom. So these are the kinds of patterns I'm looking for. Right now is a different question. What do you do right now? Because right now, the issue for both Jews and Palestinians is security, is survival, just getting enough order and law so that people can live. And that's much more important now than talking about, equality and freedom. Right now, that's the crucial question.
We're going to take some questions in just a minute. I've got one last thing to ask you, Ian, which is, can you describe the strata of rights, the cascading rights that Palestinians, and Israelis have? You've got Israeli citizens who've got full rights, full votes, and also equal. They've got a substantial amount of money allocated to ensure those rights. And then you have Israeli Palestinians who, in theory, have those rights. And then you've got East Jerusalemites, and then you've got people in the West Bank, and then finally.
The East Jerusalem category is very important, and not understood. And I'm glad you asked the question because I can highlight that. Think of it as a caste system within a state. And the highest caste right now are religious Ashkenazic ultra-nationalist Jews. It used to be kibbutz secular, that's not anymore. But then you go down the ladder to some also higher castes are the secular Ashkenazic Jews. Then, of course, the Mizrahi, Jews from Middle Eastern and Muslim
Yeah, but in
countries.
terms of absolute rights, in terms of rights within the state,
in terms of that,
I think you're referring to them not having to do military service. But beyond that, they've got all Jewish Israelis have the same rights, generally the same allocation of resources.
Yes. We'll not talk about the ultra-Orthodox, who are sort of privileged, as you know. They don't have to serve in the army. But okay, now we go to Arab Israelis who are citizens. They have the right to vote. Okay, and they are citizens, but there are many laws that circumscribe their rights, so that they are not equal. They're more or less something between blacks during the Jim Crow period and blacks during the Civil Rights period. Then there's East Jerusalem Arabs. East Jerusalem Arabs are not citizens of the country of Israel, because what Israel did in 1967 was expand the boundaries of the city of Yerushalayim to make what are now 350,000 Palestinians who live in this expanded area. They are citizens of the city, but they are not citizens of the country. So they have what are called permanent residency status, though it's not really permanent. And they can, if they wish to, vote in municipal elections. They haven't voted, most of them, because the PA has opposed them voting, but that's an issue that perhaps is changing. In the West Bank and in Gaza, the Palestinians who live there have no political rights. They, as you say, they haven't had elections in the Palestinian area, but they certainly have no input into the Israeli political system and never have. So that's the huge difference. What you see increasingly among Israeli right is talk of changing the status of the West Bank and Gaza, not to formally annex it, which would dangerously expand the rhetoric that might lead to arguments to give rights to Palestinians, but rather to impose the system in East Jerusalem on the West Bank, so that Arabs there would have more security to live there, but they would have zero political rights inside of Israel. And they might have some municipal rights. And that's that. If you look at all the laws that are being discussed in the Knesset these days about annexation, it's not really about annexation. It's about something like that. So the East Jerusalem case is very important.
I've got to tell you a little anecdote. We ran a tour of the U.S. election to the U.S. elections, and we were in Michigan, and we had two Israelis on our tour. And I found myself in the strange situation of being asked by an Israeli tank captain and his girlfriend, who had served as a 19-year-old in the IDF and was a reservist. What do they think of us in the West Bank? What do they want? And I thought, you're asking me, a Brit, and I'm here in Michigan, and you don't know the answer to that. That's a pretty fundamental, anyway.
That's interesting. That was the title of the first article I ever published in my life, which was a paper I wrote in 1969 based on interviewing Palestinian leaders in the West Bank and Gaza. What do West Bank Arabs really want? And what I said they wanted was a separate Palestinian state, that the PLO would in 5 years say that they wanted that too, but they weren't ready to. And so it goes, so that question, but what is so true even then is how few Israelis I knew that.
Yeah.
When I would go to a village, I went to a kibbutz to speak once when I was in 1973, and down the road, a kilometer, was an Arab village. And I went there just because I like to visit Arab villages. I got to know a few people. I came back, gave the talk, and I started talking about the Arab village. Not a single person in the group at the kibbutz that came to hear my talk had ever been to the village.
Yeah. So my simple answer to that is that if you're educated and middle class, you talk about a one state. Basically, they want rights. I don't care what you call this place. I want my rights. Yep. I want the same rights as you have. And for them, these two, the active member of the IDF and the reservists, this was quite shocking. They couldn't conceive the idea of Palestinians having the same rights as them, which is an idea in itself. Anyway, that's my little sort of anecdote. I'm going to put that to the side, and we're going to take a question from Elaine M. So Elaine, open your microphone, put your question to Ian.
Good evening, Professor Lustick.
Good evening.
I'm speaking to you from the integrated colony of Wales. And despite what it says on my passport, I refuse to consider myself British, given our historical involvement with the mess that is now Palestine and Israel. So in the light of your very depressing analysis at the beginning, could you perhaps outline some possible scenarios of what could occur in the immediate and midterm, and give an assessment of how likely you think those are?
Catastrophe.
Thanks, Elaine. Well, I can't do that exactly, because if I did, it would be saying that I know things that we should do that would bring about the solution, either a two-state solution or a three-state solution or a one-state solution or a federation of the Middle East. And I don't know anything that can be done now that would lead. I don't have a scenario, a plausible one, to lead to that. However, I do think that good things can happen, and I don't find my analysis depressing. Why? Because I really have accepted the idea that it's one country, one state between the river and the sea. Therefore, for example, I take heart that I no longer have to worry about whether there's another settlement, whether E1 gets settled. It doesn't matter anymore. All that means is there's more room inside the Green Line for Arabs to live. I don't have to worry that the United States recognized the United Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Fine, that means eventually all the inhabitants of the whole country will have access to the whole city of El-Quds of Jerusalem. I am able to think much more positively and honestly. In the old days, when I was a fervent two-state advocate because I believed it was possible, I was willing to make semi-racist arguments to say, you don't really want to live with all those Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, do you? I mean, you really want to live with those Arabs? No, you don't. In order not to, then we have to leave the West Bank and Gaza. Israel needs to withdraw. Well, those arguments are hardly made anymore, believe it or not, because the people who used to make them on the left need Arab votes in order to have any chance of political success. And those political alliances that are blooming between moderate Israelis, Jews, and most Palestinians who have political rights in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, those are very positive things that are happening. So the way I continue to be positive is, first of all, that I can think much more clearly about the situation. I don't have to keep lying to myself. But second of all, I extend the time frame. I'm not comparing the situation we have to a decolonization question that the Fourth Republic had in France in the 1950s. You know, maybe in which year are we going to get out of Algeria for France? I'm thinking not in terms of months and years. I'm thinking of decades and generations. And that's how democratization works in these situations. And if I could just quickly point out, there are two ways that countries democratize. One is the kill Ceausescu and you get democracy tomorrow. It's a one-bullet route to democracy. And it's very quick, top down. But if you're a democracy that has excluded masses of people for many generations, whether they're Native Americans or blacks or women, it takes that kind of democratization, the extension of the franchise, takes a much longer period of time, is much more complex, and takes different kinds of mobilizations and struggles. Those are the cases we should be learning from and looking to for understanding where this process in Israel and Palestine can go.
I would agree with you. I mean, I don't know that I've got any of the academic backing that you have, but my fundamental feeling is that this is comparable to, in terms of time spans, the difference between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. So you're talking about a century in which those rights are gained. But in the meantime, there's actually the real possibility, isn't there, of a complete catastrophe. You have a White House that is so blithe in its assumptions about security and alliances, and is quite ready, as we've seen. Trump is ready to turn the Gaza into an American-owned Mar-a-Lago or whatever, And that implicit in that is possibly a large expulsion of population. And we know that senior Israeli politicians who are allied in Netanyahu's government would quite happily force all Palestinians out of the West Bank. These things are real possibilities.
Well, certainly in Gaza, I've been amazed, frankly, that with the scale of destruction, which is much, much greater than in 48, the number of Gazans who have left Gaza or been able to get out is much, much smaller than one would have expected. Still, you are right. The possibility of demographically significant changes in the population of Gaza are present. I think that those struggles are crucial. We should be involved in bringing that to light, in showing not so much that the Trump plan is going to do that, but by creating the idea that expulsion of masses of Palestinians and transferring them is okay, helps encourage Israeli extremists. I would point out the interesting fact that the Trump-Kushner plan, if you look at it, I may be one of the only people in the world that read all 50 pages of it, but it actually imagined, along with a phony Finlandized Palestinian archipelago, that hundreds of thousands of Gazans would be transferred into Israel, into zones in the Negev along the Egyptian border that would be reconstructed residentially and agriculturally and industrially. This was the first proposal for mass return of Palestinians that an Israeli government ever responded positively to. They didn't. And I believe that I also am in favor of transferring Palestinians out of Gaza. They should be going into Israel. That is where they're from. The envelope around Gaza is mostly uninhabited. If you want them to return to Gaza eventually, okay, but if you're looking for a place where, and that's where they want to go, it's sort of the obvious place. I also think that this is the time to favor Israeli annexation. Netanyahu and other Israelis have been threatening annexation and getting paid by the international community for not doing it. Nobody should reward the Israelis for not annexing, because they already have. They just haven't said they have. And by saying they do it, you create some of the ingredients politically and rhetorically to move the situation forward toward what Biden, in his first year in office, used to talk about. It wasn't remarked on much after the war broke out, but before the war, Biden and his staff, including Blinken, repeatedly said that the two-state solution was one way to get to American goals. But the American goals in Israel and Palestine was that Israelis and Palestinians would have equal rights to security, sovereignty, dignity, and prosperity. Now, he didn't say sovereignty. Security, prosperity, dignity, and political rights. Well, that's great. If you can get that through a two-state solution strategy, fine. But the implicit in what they were saying was, and if that's not possible, we'll find other routes to gain those objectives, and namely a democracy. And that's what I think once the war broke out, Biden and company went to the safe political harbor of a phony two-state solution. But it's important to remember that that was the formula that they used in the first year of their administration.
In light of what you've been saying, and you've partly answered my question, I think, but my question is, should the PLO be demanding annexation? Is it not true that it's not really a false harbor for the PLO they might well gain the same economic support and advantages advocating annexation as they do advocating a false two-state solution, albeit it might be virtually politically impossible? And the second part of the question is, assuming that your sort of East Jerusalemization concept is extended to the West Bank, is not the suffering of Palestinians going to continue to increase? The economic decline of the West Bank will continue, and does that not undermine your gradual democratization scenario?
Yes, they should. But and in the past, during the Intifada, for example, the first Intifada, when some far-seeing Palestinians started to talk that way, they had their arms and legs broken. Many diaspora Palestinians will talk about, they don't care what the country is called, they want equal rights. They are sort of saying that. They don't want two-state solution negotiations either. They think they're phony. But I'm a little different because I'm willing to actually say what sounds a little nutty, that I favor annexation. Because that's a right-wing slogan, Palestinians can't identify with it. But effectively, yes, in my view, that's what Palestinians should say. And privately, many of them do say it. That is, if you asked Palestinians in East Jerusalem, do you want to vote in the municipal election, since that determines whether you're going to get a school, toilets near your house, sewer system, and so on? Yes, most of them want to vote in municipal elections, and they would actually produce a mayor who, in alliance with moderate Jews, would be revolutionary in that context. But they don't, because the PLO and the PA intimidate them and threaten them. They do not. Only about 4,000 or 5,000 of them vote in the elections. Why does that come? Because it interferes with the Nash equilibrium strategy that the PA has. They need to treat East Jerusalem as if it's temporarily occupied, waiting for the two-state solution to come, so that they can continue to play that role that I said. So it's not just the right wing in Israel that wants the collapse of the PA. It's also many Palestinians who want it. This is a very scary fact, that the ideological and cultural center of gravity of the military has shifted to the right. And I think that more and more, instead of thinking from a practical point of view of absorbing the West Bank by treating it as East Jerusalem, right now, in the context of the war, there's a tendency to try to treat most of the West Bank as a free fire zone, which is what Gaza has become. That's Israel's its favored disposition of Gaza is it's not part of Israel. We don't want to say it's part of Israel, but we totally control it as part of our state. Nobody else has a right to be there. But since we don't say it's a part of our state, we don't have to protect the people who are there. So on the other hand, since the international community is not going to be involved, and not allows itself to be involved, or Israel doesn't allow it to be involved, Israel will be drawn into an occupation of the West Bank, of Gaza. And its resources are stretched very thin, and I do not believe that they can carry out a forcible evacuation of the Arabs in the West Bank or in Gaza. There are, even with the rightward trend in the military. Now, that's a place for the United States and the rest of the world community to make it clear to Israel that that is unacceptable. And I think you mentioned the lobby. My current research, my current work is on the Israel lobby in the United States. It is so far away from what American interests and even the American people want that I think it's a strategically important place for people who want to protect the possibility of better futures to work on the problem of the outsized power of the Israel lobby in the United States. And in Britain, I would say, but also in the United States. Before the war, you remember the civil war that was erupting in Israel? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of demonstrators against the judicial coup. The war over what Israel will be has already started. And the Gaza war is actually just part of it. The people who were doing the judicial coup are trying to strip all the liberal aspects, and there aren't that many, out of Israeli democracy to make it a majoritarian, populist, illiberal democracy. Their main reason for doing that is that they don't believe they can get rid of the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank, and they don't want a country in which the Supreme Court says that ultimately you have to give political rights to Arabs. They want an apartheid-type country, based, except not apartheid in the sense that there's a majoritarian capacity for Jews to keep ruling. That's the left could not say that what it was doing was fighting for a country that eventually could liberate the Arabs, because they don't want to say that we blue and white flag wavers are reliant on the Arabs for our political future, but in fact they are. They will never get back into power, those moderate urban Israeli patriots without help from Palestinian Arabs who also want to live in a liberal democracy. And that will only come not just from Arabs inside the Green Line, but from Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza being emancipated. But that struggle, that's what I'm trying to say, the nation-state law, the law that stripped away the Arabic as an official language, that declared that Israel is only a country for the Jewish people. That law was passed as part of the right wing's desire to constitutionally erect barriers against future participation by Palestinian Arabs who are not currently citizens. And what we have to see, in other words, is the battles rhetorically, ideologically, culturally, and politically are really battles about when and how the Arabs of the West Bank and Gaza will be integrated into Israel.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've got one last thing to ask you. We have run over time slightly, but I do want to ask you about this. How difficult is it to do your work in the United States? And can you talk about the fact that you've been listed on something called the Canary Mission, an organization that claims to monitor and identify individuals who promote hatred of the USA, Israel, and Jews on North American college campuses and beyond?
Right. So anybody who wants to know the real answer to that story can read a piece that I published called Sitting on the Third Rail, studying Israeli and Palestinian politics for the last 50 years. I was asked to do that by young political scientists in the United States who wonder how someone could survive doing that because they're under so much pressure now. Partly, I'm Jewish. That used to give me some protection. It doesn't give me a lot anymore. I found it utterly fascinating, and I have a very weird sense of humor and a thick skin, and that's how. And I love both Israelis and Palestinians. I've always have. So those are the things that allowed me to do it. But it is very difficult. I'm emeritus now. I was tenured. It's extremely difficult now, and that's one reason I am working on the lobby and involved, for example, in struggles over this ridiculous attempt to define anti-Semitism in a propagandistic way that is designed to protect Israel against criticism. I'd also point out that I've seen things go and come. When I first started advocating for the two-state solution, I organized a campaign in graduate school called Yesh Breira, There Is an Alternative, which was to create a non-belligerent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and to stop settlement there. There were only 1,100 settlers there at the time, and I wrote in 1972 that Israel was, by settling the West Bank, locking the Jewish state into a political dungeon from which it would never escape. I was called an anti-Semite and a Nazi because I favored a two-state solution in the 70s. Now I'm called things like that because I don't favor it. But that only gives me a certain amount of faith in my ability and the ability of people who take evidence and theory seriously to figure out what's going on and see what can be done and what can't be with a little more clearly than if you don't apply yourself systematically to the evidence.
Ian Lustick, thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed this. It's been very, very informative. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
My pleasure, Nicholas. Take care, everyone.